Okay, guys, due to popular demand and, of course, my desire to speak to him again, I've got for you the first repeat guest on the Sad Truth. That should go on his CV. Dr. Jordan Peterson, how are you doing, my good man?
Good, good. Nice mic.
Oh, thank you. Rumor has it that you have a similar one.
I do. It seems to be pretty much identical.
There you go.
So, yes.
For the few people who don't know you, given that you've pretty much catapulted straight to the collective conscience of pretty much everyone over the past 6 months, you are a professor of psychology at University of Toronto. You're also a clinical psychologist, and I'd like to speak about some of your work as a clinician in today's chat. Some YouTube metrics that are bewildering because I knew you when you were just an academic, not a superstar world media star. But your YouTube channel, almost 300,000, 285,000, 12.8 plus million views, $39,316 per month Patreon support. We're going to have to talk about this because I'm not even 1/10 of that, so I need to know the secret. But the one gripe that I have with you, Jordan, is that there's a new list that came out from some organization that listed the top. I think we both had received the link to the list that listed the top 10 professors, I guess, in the world who are helping the right. Now, I expected to be number one, but to my dismay, I thought, who is the guy who's got the chutzpah to dislodge me from the number one spot? And apparently it is Jordan Peterson who's at the number one spot. So I shall forgive you. Go with God, my son. Go with God. Congratulations on the number one spot.
Well, I wanted to thank you, because back in October, when all of this started, you were, I really think, the first journalist / professor, but certainly journalist, to talk with me, and that was a big deal. And so I appreciate that because, it's during those times of initial crisis that people generally frequently get abandoned and shunned, which is, of course, something that's happened to a number of journalists in Canada recently, right? I mean, I think, so that's Ken White and Jonathan Kay from the Walrus, and Nicholas, I can't remember his name properly. I can never pronounce it properly, but Nidviecki, he got nailed. And the guy from Lavrenti, I think that's the correct pronunciation, from CBC, they all got nailed for, poking their head out of their shell and daring to say something about political correctness. All of that had to do with cultural appropriation. So there can be a heavy price to pay for that. And the fact that you interviewed me so quickly, that was a big deal and was extremely helpful. So thank you very much. I appreciate
thank you for
that.
saying so.
And this helping the right thing, that's a funny thing because that isn't what I see myself as doing. I actually don't see what I'm doing as specifically or particularly political, although it's got a political aspect. I think that this argument is a lot deeper than a political argument. Not that political arguments are trivial, but there's something going on which I think also accounts for why what I've been doing has become so popular. Because if it was just limited to the political issues, say, surrounding Bill C-16, then there'd be absolutely no reason for people, particularly people around the world, to pay attention to it, and certainly not even for Canadians to pay attention to it for more than, the fleeting moment that under normal circumstances this thing should have produced. So whoever put up that website might be thinking that you and I are helping the right, but that's a pretty narrow way of looking at it as far as I'm concerned. And I also think it's just a historical accident in some sense that, or a contextual accident, that the issues surrounding free speech have become an issue that are primarily occupying people's concern on the right and on the center. Because there's no reason that free speech shouldn't be a left-wing concern as well. It's completely insane that the left has abandoned its commitment to free speech, especially because they've historically, in their more positive guise, spoken for the working class, for example, and for people who are somewhat disenfranchised. And the only damn tool they have is the freedom to speak. the freedom to speak, because what else do they have? So
Well,
I don't know.
I
There's
think
a lot of insanity circulating around.
yeah, I think to the extent, to the extent that both you and I weigh in on specific manifestations of science denialism that comes very much from the left, then people somehow portray us as, in that sense, helping the right? So, for example, the rejection of the human mind as an empty slate, like tabla rasa, both your critique and mine of postmodernism, both of our critique of Bill C-16, and the fact that there are, sexual dimorphisms that exist within Homo sapiens. All of these things are forms of science denialism that regrettably are to be found on the left side of the political aisle, and then by proxy somehow we become right-wing nut jobs, even though
Yeah.
the only thing that you and I do is really speak about freedom of speech, about seeking truth, about pursuing evidence-based thinking. So I don't those things don't strike me as right-wing, but apparently they are.
Well, that's exactly it. Well, look, the same thing has happened to some degree to Steven Pinker. It was quite a while ago that he wrote that book, The Blank Slate. And when I read that, that's got to be 10 years, something like that, maybe
I think
more.
2002.
When I read
2002.
That, 2002. Okay,
Yeah.
so when I read that, my first response was, well, I don't see why a book like that's necessary. Jesus, it's so bloody obvious that the human mind isn't a blank slate. That argument has been settled and done with from the biological perspective for God. Near on 100 years, I would say, but even more specifically in the neurobiological realm, beyond question for 50 years. With people like Jeffrey Gray's a good example, who wrote the book, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety. We've got pretty damn good at documenting some of the neurobiological structure of cognition and emotion and motivation and all of that, thanks in large part to animal researchers. And the notion, and also it's also impossible that the human mind can be a blank slate, because the artificial intelligence people ran into that wall back in the 1960s, because they assumed that you could just extract out interpretive information from the sensory data set that presented itself with no internal structure. And that just turned out to be absolutely and completely wrong. So when Pinker wrote that book, I thought, yeah, fair enough, man. But like, anybody in the know has figured this out, so that it isn't even an issue of discussion. And then all of a sudden, and it's 15 years later, we have the sociologists in particular and the social constructionist types, like, they actually think this is debatable. Right. It's just absolutely beyond comprehension to me. So it's ignorant every possible level.
I was going to say my thinking, look, it's easy to attribute their positions to, they're just a bunch of, bumbling buffoons. But I actually think I'm going to be charitable towards them. And then you tell me what you think of my thinking. I think that a lot of the background to the empty slate premise really comes from a hopeful position, right? If we all are born with empty minds, therefore we're all born with equal potentiality, therefore we can all instantiate any life trajectory that we decide to pursue. And hence, it becomes oppressive. It becomes biological determinism to argue that maybe Michael Jordan had an innate set of morphological features and other realities that would render him to be a more likely NBA player than Saad. That is too biologically rigid. What makes a lot more sense from a charitable, hopeful position is, hey, given the right social intervention, socialization intervention, any of us could be anything we want to be. Do you think that ultimately the reason why a lot of the social scientists are parasitized by this stupidity really comes from a good place, a wrong place, but a good, hopeful place?
Look, I think that's a reasonable interpretation, although obviously, as you know, this is a multifactorial problem. But yes, part of the problem is that there is this doctrine of equality of opportunity that's a deep set part of the Western tradition, and the biological, let's say, essentialism, if we're going to call it that, does fly in the face of that if you don't think it through very carefully. So, but there's logical problems with that as well. So, for example, the people that you're talking about are also constantly beating the drum for diversity. It's like, well, where the hell does that come from? If we equalize the sociocultural context, and every difference is sociocultural, then we're going to eradicate diversity completely, which by their own hypothesis would seem to be a bad idea. They also tend to use biological essentialism when they talk about diversity, because it's always bloody sex, gender, and racial diversity, as if those are the determinants of diversity in thinking. So they're basically sneaking a biological deterministic argument into the hen house. Anyways, although I would say that the people who are doing that aren't known for their clarity of thinking or for their care about clarity of thinking, and so they don't really notice.
Right.
And they don't also notice when the biological essentialism argument is actually supporting their claims. So one of the things that I found really disturbing about Bill C-16, and I just can't understand why its proponents don't understand this, is some of the most powerful arguments for tolerance with regards to, say, sexual preference, and let's say even gender identity, is that those things are determined biologically, right? And the standard claim with regards to the transgender folks is that, well, they're born that way. I'm a man born in a woman's body. It's like, that's a biologically essentialist argument. And the notion that sexual proclivity is innate and unchanging, which is the argument that justifies the rejection of things like conversion therapy, is also a biologically essentialist argument. And those, to put it charitably, idiots who drafted Bill C-16 and the surrounding legislation on the Ontario Human Rights Commission have not thought through the fact that they just shot themselves and the people that they're supposed to be supporting directly in the foot, because they've made it, A, socially constructed, but they've even weakened that. So it's not even socially constructed anymore. It's merely a matter of subjective whim and choice. And it can vary from hour to hour, day to day. So, like, if I was a right-winger, what I would be thinking, and I was smart, and a smart right-winger, what I would be thinking is, okay, people, now you've made the claim that both sexual preference and gender identity is nothing but subjective choice. So if it's subjective choice or socially constructed, then A, I can set up social institutions to eradicate it, because why wouldn't I? Because it's malleable. And B, if it's subjective whim, then I can just forbid it. I can describe it as unethical. I can just forbid it. I mean, it's so
you're using
muddle-headed.
You're using too much logic, Jordan. As we both found out in our respective testimonies and interactions at the Canadian Senate, they're not big on logic, reason, and science. I mean, I was astonished, right? I mean, I don't know if you had a chance to watch my testimony and my interactions. I watched yours with much interest. I gave a 5-minute opening remarks where I tried to argue how there are, many ways by which pretty much anything that I either research or teach in the pursuit of my evolutionary psychology, program could be construed as transphobic systemic violence, to use the words of Harvard, because I was promulgating fixed binaries and biological essentialism. And all they wanted to talk about is how I was, a pro-genocide guy and other, posturing and grandstanding and political theater. I mean, it just shocked me, the level of discourse from these otherwise naturally lobotomized senators.
Well, I did watch what happened surrounding your testimony, the murkiness of thinking that surrounds this issue is absolutely, it's beyond, it's exactly what you see on the Ontario Human Rights Commission. It's rife with internal contradictions. And, to me, it isn't merely the fact that that's muddle-headed thinking that is going to get the people who put forward this legislation tangled up terribly in contradictions as this paradoxical theorizing manifests itself in the world. But I also think it's a deeper reflection of two things. And one is the failure of the universities to actually teach people how to think. And that's what's manifesting itself in this kind of so-called leadership. And the second is the contempt that's held by the postmodernists for such thing as logic, and of course that's most evident in Derrida's famous critique of Western culture as fell logocentric, and all these biological essentialist critics who seem to think that the scientific method is nothing but a manifestation of cultural oppression and nothing else. But that makes sense given that they don't believe in an objective world of any sort. So they don't believe in bounds of the world, and they believe that everything is a fiction in some sense. And I mean, God.
I feel your pain. I see and hear your pain. Do you think that in light of it now going through, I mean, it's going to eventually pass, I suspect. I guess the final vote is soon, correct? Isn't it happening soon?
It's happening soon. I know that right now, though, that Senator Platt is negotiating with the Minister of Justice for an amendment that would clearly state that nothing in Bill C-16 requires abridgment of free speech. That's the more general attempt to amend, but even more specifically, that misgendering someone using normative gender language will not be regarded as either harassment nor discrimination. Now, you see, the Justice Minister actually said that publicly. So Platt is now pushing her to accept this amendment, but I think they'll reject it out of hand because their true motivations, as far as I'm concerned, are outlined much more clearly on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website. And the motivations of those people are, I don't think that you can understand what they're doing at all without going into the postmodern rabbit hole and drawing the conclusion that they are trying to bring down the phallogocentric system. They're trying to bring it to its knees.
Right.
It's the only explanation to me that makes sense. So to the degree that it makes sense.
Is there a way for you to, sorry, just a technical thing, to focus your camera? You're a bit grainy. Is there a way to focus it while we're chatting?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't be.
If not, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I just want the camera to capture all your glorious, beautiful face. That's all.
Oh well, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
All right.
No, I think at the moment, I've got it adjusted as much as my limited technical knowledge makes that possible.
No worries.
I still haven't got it masked completely.
No worries.
So,
okay,
but it's coming along.
Let's move on from Bill C-16. You and I met following our Manning conference presentations. We were both sitting on the same panel on an issue of campus freedom of speech and so on. And then after that, we went to lunch with Janice Fiamengo and her husband and had a very nice conversation. And at the time, we had agreed that the conversation was so interesting that the next time we would chat, we would try to replicate some of that stuff. So I had jotted down some of the things that we had talked about, some of which dealt with your clinical work. And then later we could drill down to some evolutionary mechanisms that could be used in the pursuit of clinical practice. So the first question, to repeat some of the stuff that we had talked about, I wanted to tell the viewers who may not know this, but you know it, given our conversation. At one point, when I was trying to decide which field in the behavioral sciences that I would like to specialize in, I thought about becoming a clinician, but then decided that based on my own reading of the literature and all that I had seen, that there was so much fuzziness and muddled stuff and quackery. I mean, of course, not all of it, but there was so much craziness going on, going back all the way to, the psychoanalytic traditions of Freud et al., that I just didn't feel that somehow it was on solid grounds. And then I read a book by Robin Dawes called House of Cards in reference to the clinical industry, where he seemed to intimate very much my concerns. I ended up, of course, going more into the behavioral sciences, consumer behavior, evolutionary psychology. So what is your first response to that concern? Obviously, you're someone who's very science-based, who's very evidence-based, yet, of course, you're very aware that there's endless amount of quackery within the clinical tradition. What do you think about this issue?
Sure. Well, okay. So that I think that's actually relatively easily addressed. I mean, most of the high-end clinical programs, clinical psychology in particular, follow the Boulder model that was established in Colorado. It must be damn near 50 years ago, I would say, where the optimal background for clinical psychologists was deemed to be scientist-practitioner, with a heavy emphasis on the first. And so clinical programs, before they became infested by social justice warriors, let's say, clinical programs ensured, like the one at McGill that I went through, ensured that clinicians were scientists first and clinicians second. And so they were supposed to be, and were trained to interpret the scientific literature and to take an evidence-based approach to their practice. And I think that that's been extremely successful. Clinical psychology programs of that sort are very difficult to get into. You have to have a very good bachelor's degree. You have to know your statistics, and you have to be scientifically trained, generally speaking. And then that's the primary emphasis during the clinical training. And so at McGill, for example, the clinical students had as much experimental training as the experimental psychology students, plus all the clinical training. And that is also something that really separates us from physicians, because people think of physicians as scientists, but they're not. They're not trained scientifically really at all. They're not trained in statistics. They don't really know how to interpret scientific literature, and they're not critical thinkers of the same sort. Now, that's obviously, I'm painting them with a broad brush, but that's generally the case. And then I would also say that there are a number of doctrines that are associated with clinical psychology that are very well supported scientifically. And I could lay out a few of those, which I think are the fundamental elements of clinical practice. One is that it's extraordinarily useful to help people discover what it is that they're avoiding because of fear and other negative emotion that constitutes an obstacle on the pathway to their goals. So fear per se isn't the issue, because of course fear is a good thing. That's why you don't run out and play in traffic. But fear that stops you from pursuing something that you need to pursue can be a crippling issue. And breaking those fears down into manageable pieces and having people master them, that works. And part of the reason it works is because that's how people learn. All it is the application of a very good pedagogical theory to the problem of emotion regulation. So, for example, when you have a child who's anxious and you bring them to a playground for the first time and they're sort of hanging around your legs, maybe they're 3, being nervous, you say, well, go out there, just go out and take a look at the other kids, get a little closer to them until you calm down, and then maybe go and say hi to someone. You break it into manageable pieces, and that's part of the confrontation with the dragon and all of that. There's a whole underlying psychoanalytic symbolic reality to that that's really deep and profound, and that works like a charm. And it's a huge part of clinical practice. Another element of clinical practice is the attempt to delineate practical problems in a very, very differentiated sense, and then to think through their solutions strategically, which is part of the reason I really like behavioral psychologists, because I would say that my clinical practice is first of all behavioral, then cognitive, then psychoanalytic, in that order, because there's no reason not to start with simple behavioral transformations like, well, do you eat 3 meals a day? Do you have a regular sleep and wake cycle? Do you have any friends? Do you have the social skills that are necessary to pursue social and intimate relationships? Do you have plans for a career? These are very, very practical things, and psychologists can be extraordinarily good at helping people work those things through. And so there's an element of clinical psychology that's crazily practical. I think it gets more esoteric, in my experience, when you're dealing with more creative people. And I think the psychoanalytic approaches, for example, especially approaches like the Jungian approaches that involve dream interpretation, they seem to be much more appropriate when you're dealing with highly creative people, and that's a relatively small proportion of the population. So I think that clinical psychology, in its most sophisticated form, is a well-grounded discipline, and that most of the people who are practicing it, who are from the big research institutes and that were trained in this scientist-practitioner model, are extremely conversant with the scientific literature, and many of them are publishing scientists. That was really the model, and so I think it's a really good model. And there's degenerate forms of practice in every discipline, and that has often to do with the competence of the people who are practicing. But I don't think there's any reason to be particularly pessimistic about clinical psychology in particular, because I think it's a good, helpful discipline.
I think the only thing that I would say, and you're exactly right, I'm familiar with the science practitioner model, is that by the very nature of what is being done as part of talk therapy, it somehow allows for a greater possibility of quackery to seep into it, if only because it's a more difficult thing to study. So for example, if you are doing efficacy, studying the efficacy of a particular drug, it might be a bit easier to set up the type of experimental designs that allow you to know whether if you take this particular statin, it will or won't reduce your LDL cholesterol scores. My sense is that notwithstanding the fact that, of course, most of the serious clinical psychologists are very versed in scientific thinking, it is always easy for, your personal biases to step in, quackery to step in, not necessarily because clinical psychology can't be scientifically based. It's a bit more difficult given the nature of what is taking place to reach the same evidentiary threshold, for example, when you're checking the effectiveness of an intervention strategy than it would for pharmaceuticals. Is that true?
I actually don't think it is, but it's not because of the lack of difficulty with regards to evidentiary standards in relationship to communication. I think that's true. But I think that the flaws that you're pointing out in relationship to communication are obviously not specific to communication in the therapeutic realm. That's the downfall of communication in general. But I think you're overestimating the clarity of most pharmaceutical research. It's unbelievably difficult to do proper pharmaceutical research, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is that very few people who have a psychological disorder, very many people who have a psychiatric disorder have multiple psychiatric disorders. They're on multiple drugs, and they have been for a long time, and they often have, or they frequently have, alcohol and drug abuse problems as well. And so they're very messy, let's say, as research subjects, and that's a huge problem. The next problem is dose and time of day of administration really matter, and that's a deadly thing to try to get straight even with a single person, much less a clinical trial. And then there's the additional complications of sex and menstrual cycle and age, which are also like horribly complicated problems. And then the worst one is, and this is an absolute killer for clinical research, is who the hell do you use for a control population? Because you can't randomly assign to group, right? Because you take your clinically affected population and you think, okay, we have to control them. We have to match them with a control group. But the thing is, with random assignation to group, you solve the problem of the fact that every single person differs or is the same across an almost infinite number of axes. And so you take care of that by randomization. And you can't do that in clinical trials because you can't randomize. So like, here's an example. Let's say you want to study antisocial personality disorder and its treatment. And so you want to set up a control group. Well, do you control for alcoholism? Because that's part of antisocial personality disorder. Do you control for attention deficit disorder? Because that overlaps with antisocial personality disorder. Do you take people from the same families? Do you take people from the same ethnic background, racial background? Do you match people for IQ? Do you match them for temperament? And the answer to that is you don't know, because you don't know how all of those additional features actually overlap with the problem that you're trying to solve. And so clinical research, whether it's pharmaceutical or associated, let's say, with talk therapy, is staggeringly difficult. And I don't actually think it's more difficult with regards to non-pharmaceutical interventions than it is with regards to pharmaceutical interventions. I think it's virtually impossible in both situations. And like, one of the things that I actually have told my students quite frequently, never to do a clinical intervention study, because they take forever. They're bounded to such a degree by ethical constraints with these absurd ethics committees that the universities have also imposed on researchers, that they're almost impossible to get off the ground. They have a high probability of failure. They take forever. It's almost impossible to get participants. You only get one publication, and the chances that it's going to work out without some fatal error is almost zero. And so I think the people who do clinical research are crazily heroic, because the downside is so high. We did clinical research with the Future Authoring program. I think I've talked to you a little bit about that. That's a program that my colleagues and I designed to help people delineate out a vision for the future and then make a plan. That was easier because we could actually assign because it was an experimental intervention and not for people who had psychiatric disorders, we could actually assign people randomly to groups. And that thing worked like a charm. It had very, very positive effects on people's motivation and their tendency to stick through university programs, for example. That was a more straightforward example of clinical intervention research, but even that's just, you have to get the institutions on board, and you have to long-term follow-up. And then I would also end this by noting that we also do not want to make the mistake of thinking that medicine or its variants like clinical psychology are sciences, because they're not. To my way of thinking, they're variants of engineering, and they have a practical aim, and the practical aim is to improve individual human functioning. And the reason I think that that's not precisely scientific is because the notion of optimized human function is a weird hybrid between objective measurement and ethical presupposition. Because you could say that what a clinical psychologist is doing is not only helping someone relieve suffering, which maybe is easier to measure empirically, but also to move them towards a better life. And that's a deeply philosophical issue. And so I don't think you can also judge the practice of clinical psychology or medicine by strictly scientific standards. I think you have to judge it in some ways the same way that you judge an engineering project, which is something like, well, does the bridge stand up? And obviously you can determine that scientifically to some degree, but some of it's a bounded cognitive problem with a pragmatic aim that can't fit easily into the purely scientific realm. I mean, you could say that what you're trying to do with clinical patients, let's say, or clients, is to normalize their behavior. But then you're making the metaphysical claim that normative constitutes the ideal towards which a therapeutic process should aim. And that's not self-evident. Often you're aiming for something that's more akin to an ideal, which then, of course, brings you into the realm of ethical philosophy. So, but I'm not particularly pessimistic about clinical psychology, especially when it's practiced by people who are, let's say, who have PhDs from high-end research schools that have been trained scientifically. I think it's a valid field.
So let me push back a bit here.
Sure, no problem.
So also in our chat during that lunch, I talked about a finding. I don't remember the reference that showed that of all of the characteristics of a therapist, the one that I guess has the highest, is the highest predictor of the efficacy of the actual intervention is the empathy of the therapist. So from that perspective, you could be someone, and by the way, please don't think that I'm trying to denigrate clinical psychology. I'm
not taking any of this person.
Okay. It's really to sort of raise these issues so that people can understand the types of struggles that as behavioral scientists we go through. So if empathy is the predominant predictor of how well your interaction with a therapist will how effective it will be, then you could have a guy with all of the credentials in the world, but who actually doesn't have some of the human qualities that you would desire. And all the training in the world, you and I can agree, all the practicums and all the the stuff that you have to go through as part of your clinical training could not make someone who is innately aloof, who's cold. We could try to intervene and have them better bedside manners, so to speak. But you're either warm or you're not, and you know this better than most. And so if empathy is the one that is most critical, then I can go speak to my friend who has zero clinical training, but on a human level is incredibly good listener, empathetic, has got good theory of mind. And that person might end up being giving me a lot more solace than the highly trained therapist. Is this something that concerns you?
Well, okay, I've got a couple of things to say about that. The first is that the category of empathy is a very ill-defined category. So, for example, my student Raymond Marr and I, he's a professor at York now, a while back we attempted to take a number of empathy measures and to administer them simultaneously to a group of people and then to see if they correlated. Because if they're all measuring the same thing, then they should all point in the same direction, right? But they don't.
Convergent discrimination.
That's the one, man. That's the one. And they don't at all. And so empathy is a very poorly defined construct. Now, you could associate it, I think, most reasonably with agreeableness in the big five trait terminology. But I don't think that there's any pronounced evidence that agreeableness is a great predictor of therapeutic outcome for clinicians. And that may be possibly because the research hasn't been done. Now, I haven't looked at that research for a long time. But the thing is that you don't know what it is that people mean when they say empathy. They may mean something like, see, because I think that and I got a fair bit of this from thinking a lot about what Carl Rogers said about the therapeutic practice, is that although my sense of the goal of the therapist is modified from the Rogerian perspective, because I think he made a mistake with his formulation of unconditional positive regard. I don't buy that, because like if I'm working with someone, and I would say I try to do the same thing in my interpersonal interactions with people, I don't have unconditional positive regard for the person. What I have is an alliance with the part of the person that is aiming at helping them manifest a more productive, less suffering-ridden, and generally socially beneficial life. And, you know, I see the war, let's say, in Solzhenitsyn terms, between good and evil going on in the hearts of people. And often when I'm in a clinical practice or in a general discussion with people, I can see a part of them that's extraordinarily self-destructive. And I am not an ally of that part. I don't have unconditional positive regard for that part. I have unconditional positive regard for the person, the part of the person that's trying to transcend that. And generally, that's why they're coming to me, is because they're being oppressed by their own internal critic, let's say, like a diabolical, malevolent internal critic. And that creature is definitely not my friend. And so I think that what the empathy is that it's empathy isn't the right way to think about it. There's a great book, by the way, that's recently published called Against Empathy that actually goes into the problems with the formulation of empathy, because it's something more like, I think love is a better way of thinking about it, technically speaking, which is that what you want from a therapist and anyone that you're communicating with intimately is your assurance, your belief that they are on your side. And so that means they want your life to be better. They're not competing with you at some unconscious level. They're not trying to undermine you in some malevolent way, underhanded way. So they listen to you, they find out what you want, they strategize with you so that you can get it. And this is applied empiricism in the clinical domain. It's like, because, well, you know, one of the things I do with my clients is that, okay, they come and see me and I say, all right, as far as you're concerned, what's wrong? What's wrong with your life? Like, what is it that's tormenting you? And often those aren't psychological issues, by the way. Those people are often tormented by tormenting things. You know, they have sick family members. They have an illness of their own. They faced an economic catastrophe. Like, it's real problems in life. They're much more common than psychological disorder, although that can complicate it. So I find out, okay, what's wrong and what's that doing to you? And then we can decompose that into its constituent elements and start to attack those one by one. And then the other thing I want to find out is, okay, hypothetically speaking, if you could have what you wanted, say, as a consequence of working with me for a year, what would the desirable outcome look like? What are we aiming at? And we want to flesh that out, and then we want to subject it to deep critical analysis to make sure that the goals are proper. And then we want to strategize, and we want to test those strategies. And see, I don't think of that as empathy, because I think that it's far too multidimensional to be reduced to empathy, which is best defined as big five trait agreeableness. And, you know, I would say for a clinician, analytic intelligence is a major advantage, because you want someone who can help you strategize. Experience in multiple dimensions matters. Their commitment to your well-being, their capacity to listen, which is a huge, and that again is not precisely empathy. It's like, I want to listen to you if I'm a clinician, because I know I'm ignorant. And the reason that I say it that way is because you're not me. And what's best for you is not necessarily what I think would be best for you. And also not necessarily what would be best for me. Because, like, for example, I know my temperament reasonably well. I'm high in openness, so I'm really interested in ideas above all else, and I'm fairly extroverted. I'm not particularly emotionally stable. I'm a little more agreeable than I would like to be. And I'm very industrious on the conscientiousness end. So for me, the ideal life is an intellectual life that requires a tremendous amount of continual work. I love that. But for many people, and including people in my practice, if they're agreeable, for example, their primary concern is the quality of their primary intimate relationship, let's say. And that's how they actually recount their life autobiographically. It's as a series of intimate relationships. Now, intimate relationships are important to me, but they wouldn't come out as number one. And so the listening element too is, I don't want to foist my value structure on you, with the possible exception of insistence upon truth in communication, because I don't bloody well know how it is that you should be in the world. And you're not the same as me. And that goes back, at least to some degree, to that biological essentialism. I mean, people actually are different. So
now, do you think that there is, so for example, in mating, there is this idea of associative mating, right? Birds of a feather flock together, short of one or two other attributes. For example, when it comes to your major histocompatibility complex, your immunological profile, we tend to prefer people who are different from us for obvious evolutionary reasons. So is there a similar match in terms of the tango dance between the therapist and the patient, and that Jordan Peterson might be the ideal guy, given his unique personhood, to work with person A, but take the exact same Jordan Peterson, put him with person B and his unique personhood, there is a clash, such that it's not so, Jordan Peterson didn't change. He's the same guy with the same set of tools, with the same attributes, with the same faults, but yet he matches with A and he mismatches with B. Is that something that you've seen, and is there research that has looked at that sort of match or mismatch?
Yeah, the research looking at that isn't well developed because it's so damn complicated. There's so many dimensions that need to be evaluated. I would say that I'm particularly suited to work with people who are creative, and I actually have a biased sample of clients who are creative.
So creative means that they're professors, they're writers, creative in the sense that they create things, or just as part of their inherent personhood. They might be mechanics, but they're creative thinkers.
Well, I would say that it's more that than the previous. Okay. Many of them, because you can break creativity into two factors, more than two, but let's start with two. One is divergence of thinking, right? So creative people, well, one good example is like if you give people just a simple task, like let's say write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S in 3 minutes. Generally speaking, the more extroverted, the more creative, and the more intelligent people are going to come up with more words. It's actually quite a powerful predictor of creativity. If you ask people to do a divergent thinking test, like a Torrance creativity test, like how many uses can you think of for a brick in 3 minutes? You score that by absolute number of responses. But then you also score it, use multiple raters to do this, but you can do it very reliably. You score it by infrequency of response combined with practical applicability. So, it can't, like you can't use a brick as a parachute unless you're trying to be funny, which is also a creative response. But for a creative response, you want a response that not very many other people have generated in the same amount of time, but that actually has practical utility. So it has to be novel and useful is roughly the criteria. And you can get a pretty good estimate of people's intrinsic creativity by doing a test like that or a sequence of tests like that. And I would say, okay, and that's separate from whether or not people have taken that ability and then translated it into actual creative products. So you can test creative thinking and you can test creative achievement. And they overlap, obviously, because the latter isn't really possible without the former. But the former is possible without the latter. I would say that I'm better suited to dealing with people who think creatively, a subset of whom would be also creative achievers. And the reason for that is because I'm interested in mythology and symbolism and dreams and all of that. That's the world within creative, that's the world that creative people inhabit. They often dream more, for example, and they're more interested in their dreams, and they're interested in ideas, and they're interested in narrative and fiction and all of that. And so they're more naturally, they have a more natural affiliation with me.
Right.
Now, I have clients, and have had many, that I would say were more conscientious and conservative and less creative. And with those people, I generally concentrate on pragmatic strategizing, which I also happen to like. But it isn't necessarily self-evident, and I don't want to be overstating my qualifications here. I can deal with a fairly broad variety of people because I have a broad variety of approaches.
Right.
And behavioral approaches work very well for almost everyone because they're so practical. But then on top of that, there are people, particularly creative people, who need an additional level of interpretation, because it's actually quite difficult to be creative because you keep transforming your identity, and it's also very hard to monetize. And so those people have a lot of opportunity in front of them, but they also have a harder time settling into a mode of being, which is why most people are essentially conservative, right? They develop one mode of being, and then they specialize in that. And it's a bit narrow, and it's rough on them if the environment around them transforms rapidly, because they also can't transform. But man, it's a lot simpler. And conservatives in general, who tend to be low in creativity, by the way, are also tend to be happier than the more liberal investigative types. And I think that's because their lives just aren't rife with as much complexity.